Welcome back to the show. I am here with Kara Collier. Did I say that right?
You said it right, yeah.
I just asked you, and of course I mess it up.
That was perfect.
It's still early, I think. Well, for you're in
I'm
Washington
on East
D.C.
Coast, so yeah,
Okay,
it's
so
noon.
it's yeah, noon. Well, I guess it's really not that early, but anyway, I'm so excited to have you on the show today. Before we get started, do you want to give the listeners just a little bit of your background, how you got into nutrition, just kind of a bit of
Mhm.
your story?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a registered dietitian. I've pretty much been interested in nutrition all of my life, and I always knew I wanted to go into nutrition. Played sports growing up, and then I started my career in a pretty traditional setting, working in a hospital. So I did that for a few years and was extremely frustrated with my experiences in the traditional healthcare system. So I was seeing people way too late, way past when you should be like preventing disease or catching it early. I was working primarily in ICUs and critical care nutrition, and people were coming to me with severe complications of lifestyle related diseases.
Mhm.
So, having diabetes for 30 years, and now we have to amputate their foot, or having hypertension for 40 years, and now they're going on permanent kidney dialysis. So it was really frustrating. That is a really hard stage at someone's life to then make meaningful lifestyle changes when you're that far along. And then the healthcare system itself is not great about preventative health.
Mhm.
They're there, mostly to treat an acute illness or acute issue. So it's very hard to make meaningful changes in that sort of setting. And there's no motivation for behavior change in that setting either,
Mhm.
because you're feeling sick, you're not feeling good. So I did that for a few years. It was a great experience, but it was really tough to see all that suffering that felt like it was suffering for no reason. So from there, I kind of, did some other nutrition software startup type companies, and then learned kind of about entrepreneurship and running a business. And then I helped two guys start the company that I'm at now called Nutrisense. So there I am the director of nutrition. And what we're trying to do at Nutrisense is fix a lot of those problems I was seeing in the hospital system. So we are using continuous glucose monitors, which I'm sure we'll dive into,
Mhm.
as a tool to help you understand your body and your metabolic health and prevent chronic conditions or optimize your body. So we're really trying to catch these things early and with personalized nutrition, real data, and not just vague nutrition guidelines. So that's where I'm at now, and I absolutely love it. And I'm sure we'll geek out on glucose
Yeah.
related topics, but it's been awesome so far.
That is so cool. And it's something that, I mean, like exactly what you said, just the whole preventative aspect of things and like thinking about that versus like you said when you were working in the hospital and they were coming too late, like that's exactly why I love nutrition as well, and
Mm-hmm.
like that's a huge piece of like why I love helping people and coaching people through that, because it's not all about like, I mean, a lot of my clients are come to me for body composition and losing weight and body fat and all of that. But once we address like all the other issues and stuff like that, like yeah, the weight loss and the fat loss comes,
Mm-hmm.
but it's truly about just becoming healthier and not having to deal with these things, these diseases and things like that down the line. So I mean, I just love what you guys are doing. So
Yeah.
yeah, I want to dive in. So I guess the first question or topic I want to talk about is, what you guys do at Nutrisense. And with the continuous glucose monitoring, usually when people hear, well, some people don't even know what that is, but
Mm-hmm.
probably most people listening to this podcast do. But usually when you hear, a continuous glucose monitor or testing your blood sugar, you usually right away think of diabetes. So can you tell us kind of why it's important or why it's beneficial for like just your average person to be tracking their glucose levels and blood sugar levels versus, it just being for people who are already diabetic?
Yeah, absolutely. So most of the time, these devices, these continuous glucose monitors, are only available by prescription for an insulin-dependent diabetic. So a lot of people are thinking of it that way. At Nutrisense, we're specifically only taking non-diabetics because we really want to help all those other people get this data because we think it's super, super important for everybody to be monitoring their glucose.
Mm-hmm.
So glucose as a metric, I always describe it as the newest vital sign, because it's not just telling you a risk for diabetes, it's also giving you insight into all of your food choices, meal timing, exercise routine, sleep, stress. So it's just like heart rate or blood pressure, where it's telling you 24/7 what's going on inside of your body. So if you think of our bodies as like a car, we always need some fuel available to run properly. So glucose is always in our system. Whether you're diabetic or not, we always need to maintain a certain level of glucose in the bloodstream. So when it's in this certain range that we're looking for, that's a good sign that our metabolic health is in good condition, right? So we work really hard to keep it in this tight range. And when it starts to deviate a little too high or possibly a little too low, that's an early signal that something is going wrong with our metabolic health, that these metabolic processes are not working perfectly. So if you catch these things really early on a CGM, it's very hard to catch it early on traditional lab markers, because you're just not seeing the nuances and the day-to-day changes. If you catch it early, you can prevent most chronic lifestyle-related conditions, not just diabetes. Glucose is also related to, heart disease and hypertension and chronic kidney disease and dementia. So they're all very linked to glucose because it's our primary metabolic fuel. Mm-hmm. So for a CGM for a non-diabetic, I think, the most important reason is that it gives you a very good indication of your general metabolic health in a way that you wouldn't be able to know before. So those early yellow flags. The other main reason that I think all people should be wearing a CGM, at least for a small amount of time in their life, is because we have so many interpersonal differences. Everybody at the end of the day is really, really unique. And there's some foods that would be considered whole foods or healthy that you might really have a huge glucose spike to, and I might have no glucose spike to at all. But there's a lot of variability between people. So just for example, one of the foods that gives me the highest glucose spike is sweet potatoes, which is like a generally well-recommended starchy vegetable among, nutrition world. And then my colleague, who's a dietitian, similar age, similar weight, height, exercise patterns, she barely moves at all from sweet potatoes. And we're just very different. And you don't know this unless you're measuring it. So it does help you identify trouble foods or foods that work well for you in a way that you wouldn't be able to quantify otherwise. And sort of the final reason is this accountability factor. So I always tell people we all know things like ice cream or cookies are bad for us, but it feels pleasurable in the moment, right? Mm-hmm. So it's very hard to stick to your goals sometimes when you're not getting any immediate feedback. So when you get that immediate feedback, it's bad, but when you see the data in real life from your body, it's so much easier to say no to those foods and to stay on track because you're getting that real-time feedback. Just like an Oura Ring or HRV is helpful for real-time feedback, it really drives behavior change. So I love that component about any type of data, not just a CGM.
Yeah, for sure. I am all about data. I think it's super, super important, just tracking that. And it doesn't, tracking glucose and those levels is super, super cool to see that, especially what you said, with actually seeing it yourself, seeing what your literally your body is doing when you consume a food. I think that's just so cool. But then also, for example, with a lot of my clients, we track biofeedback metrics every single day. So sleep, stress, which I want to dive into too, how that kind of relates to your glucose levels, stress, especially because that's something that a lot of people don't think about. But yeah, biofeedback and data is just so important. And I think, people who are struggling, especially with, body, fat loss, for example, I use that all the time because that's where most of my clients come to me for. And it's if you're not tracking and you don't know what's going on with these different things, it just makes it so much harder to make changes, right? And to make accurate changes for you as an individual. So yeah, I'm all about the data.
100%.
So can we talk a little bit about kind of the actual ranges for, what might be an optimal range to be in with your blood glucose levels, and kind of why that might be different from kind of the traditional numbers that we've all kind of been used to hearing, from our doctors or maybe, dive into that?
Yeah. So there are 3 general trends when you are wearing a continuous glucose monitor that we're paying attention. One is your fasting glucose, so without food for at least 8 hours. One is your postprandial response, so how your glucose responds after you eat. And then the third is glycemic variability, or just the general swings in your glucose. So starting with a fasting glucose value, you will get this at like a standard lab draw from your doctor as well. And typically, if it's below 100, they will consider that normal. So 100 to 126 would be pre-diabetes, and then above that would be diabetes. But if you come back with a level of 99, they probably won't say anything, and it will just be, within normal range. And we at Nutrisense, we hold it to a higher standard. We want to see fasting glucose values between 70 and 90. There is a huge body of evidence that fasting glucose values above 90 start to become an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, insulin resistance. So interestingly, that threshold used to be 110 for prediabetes, and they lowered it to 100 a couple years ago, maybe. I don't remember the exact date. And so I have a feeling it will get lowered eventually again, and it's just kind of, always a little behind with the actual regulatory bodies making these guidelines, but below 90 is definitely what I want to see for a fasting glucose value. And then regards to if you're going to your doctor to assess, these glucose values, you'll probably just get a fasting glucose value and a hemoglobin A1C. So we can touch on A1C. I don't love A1Cs because they are not a great marker for how your glucose values are doing. They're just measuring average glucose based off of your red blood cells. So inherently it misses variabilities, right? It's not telling you any swings or ups and downs. It's just telling you an average. But it's also just not a very sensitive marker for your actual glucose status. It's making the assumption that your red blood cell lives for 90 days when a lot of people's red blood cells don't live for 90 days. So if you have anemia, or you had blood loss recently, or you are a smoker, many other reasons, certain medications, your red blood cell lifespan might be skewed. So that could give you either, a false positive or a false negative on the A1C test. So research has checked this, and there's only about a 50% sensitivity for this A1C test. So only about 50% of the time is it giving us true indication of glucose values.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah, so a lot of people will come to us and they'll have three months of CGM data, and they'll be like, I just got new hemoglobin A1C and it's high. And I'm like, well, we see your real glucose data right here. We know what's actually going on. I'm not concerned about your A1C because it might be skewed for some other reason. So.
Gotcha. And so in terms of, I kind of want to dive into fasting glucose a little bit, because a lot of people who listen to this podcast are either, following a lower carb or a ketogenic lifestyle. And I know that that's something that comes up. There's, this concept of the dawn phenomenon. Can we dive into that a little bit, or just maybe explain that? Because I get a lot of questions sometimes, I've been keto for, and this, we can kind of talk about the concept of physiological insulin resistance versus pathological insulin resistance and all that, and maybe break that down into not so sciencey terms. But I do have questions, or people that have come to me that say, I've been keto or low carb for a long time, and all of a sudden, my fasting blood glucose numbers are trying to go up. What does that mean? Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So the dawn phenomenon is something that happens in everybody. It's normal. And it's usually, depending on what your sleep-wake cycle is, it's usually between 4 and 8 a.m. that glucose kind of increases a little bit. And this is just due to a release of hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline. It's kind of like our waking up hormones. So our natural coffee. And glucose increases during that time, but we should also have a release of insulin that follows that helps bring it back down to normal. So on somebody's CGM data, you'll see this. It might go from 80 to 90 and then come back down to 80, maybe an hour or so after they've been awake and they're moving around. So that is a normal occurrence. In a diabetic, on the other hand, their rise in glucose is exaggerated. So it might go from 80 to 110, and then they don't have an appropriate insulin response to this. So then it will stay at 110 or whatever number it rose to for a while. So that's the difference. In a normal, healthy, functioning human being, we should see that come back down within an hour of waking up. With diabetics, we don't really see that. And then that is different than the physiological insulin resistance. So we could definitely dive into that.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to like ask you 5 questions at once.
No, you're fine. I'm happy to dive into it but it's a big question. It's something we're dealing with a lot. A lot of our customers follow a ketogenic diet or very low carbohydrate in some sense, might be carnivore and not actually ketogenic. And so basically what's happening with this physiological insulin resistance, the hallmark sign is that over time that fasting glucose level rises. So what we'll see is, people are getting their labs like once a year, like an annual checkup. And 5 years ago when they started, maybe before they started keto and they were overweight or pre-diabetic, their fasting glucose was 90, and then they started keto and it was down to 80, and that's very good direction. And then a year into keto it was like 80 still, and then maybe 2 years into keto it's back up to 90, and then 3 years into keto it's in the hundreds, and they're wondering what the heck is going on. Like, I've never felt better, I fixed all these other things, but my fasting glucose value is rising. So the first thing that I always want to check in this scenario is other lab markers to make sure everything else looks good and it's just this isolated increase in a fasting glucose level. So if you think about pathological insulin resistance, which is what is occurring in diabetes or these other chronic health, chronic diseases, we are seeing a rise in fasting glucose values, but we are also seeing a rise in fasting insulin levels. So they should be going in the same direction in pathological insulin resistance. So this is a sign that your body is making a ton of glucose and then also pumping out a ton of insulin to help correct it, but the cells aren't responding to the effects of insulin, so the body's making even more insulin, and then it's the glucose going even higher, and it's this cycle, right? With physiological insulin resistance, we are seeing fasting glucose values rise, but fasting insulin levels should be low. So getting a fasting insulin level drawn is not necessarily routine. It won't be part of like a standard blood draw, but I do recommend that these people ask for it and check their fasting insulin to see what's going on. Most of the time it's below normal limits. So usually we want to see a fasting insulin between like 3 and 8. And a lot of times these people will see a fasting insulin at like 1 or 2. So it's really, really low because the body has learned, they're like, carbs are never coming in. I don't really need to make that much insulin, right? They're like, I'm just going to keep supply and demand. The body is very smart. So they're decreasing the insulin we need, but glucose is rising. So if fasting insulin is low, if we're monitoring like, HDL and triglycerides over time, and those still are normal or not trending up, if we're monitoring inflammatory markers, blood pressure, HRV, weight, I want to still track all of those things in correlation to the fasting glucose level and make sure that those are all also good. But then if only the fasting glucose is rising, then we can further identify that this is actually physiological insulin resistance, or also called adaptive glucose sparing. Okay. So what is happening here, if all that checks out and all we see is that fasting glucose is rising over time because you've had very low carbohydrate diet, then this means that the body has now adapted, right? The body is super adaptable and it will reduce peripheral insulin sensitivity. So normally the muscles are a huge sink for glucose. So when we eat a carbohydrate rich meal and we have glucose in the bloodstream, our muscles are going to pick up most of that glucose. But if we're never eating carbohydrates, the muscles are going to start to be in glucose refusal mode and only want fat for fuel. So it reduces that insulin sensitivity in the muscles so that the body naturally raises fasting glucose levels so that glucose is always present for glucose sensitive organs like the brain. The body gets smart and it's like, you're never going to give me glucose. I'm going to make sure there's enough present for these organs that are really glucose sensitive. So it's sort of this natural adaptation that occurs. And then that begs the big question that everybody wants to know, is this a bad thing, right? Like, should I be concerned if everything else checks out and it's just my fasting glucose levels rising? Should I even care? And we don't know the answer to that question, unfortunately. No research has been done on this. I know. No research has been done on this. I have talked to several experts in the field about what they think, and we've all kind of come to a similar conclusion that, if all those other lab markers check out, it's probably fine, but it is a signal that you are metabolically inflexible, right? So you no longer can tolerate carbohydrates as a fuel source, and you now are very reliant on fats and ketones. So it's like, we're not totally sure if we should be if it's actually pathological or if it's going to increase disease risk. If you never cheat, if you're like totally confident you're never you don't want carbs ever again, then it's probably fine. It's probably not going to be a big deal. But if you're somebody who every once in a while has a big carb meal, maybe every couple weeks you're having a lot of carbs on the weekends, you're probably, because you have this reduced insulin load, you're probably having huge glucose spikes to that, because your body no longer knows how to tolerate glucose. It freaks out if you have a carb heavy meal. So if you think you ever want to have carbs, we might want to increase that metabolic flexibility so that you can tolerate both fuels. So I personally, if I saw that happening in my data, I would not want that, because I want to be flexible and have the ability to kind of choose what I want to eat. My body responds okay, but we don't know for sure that it's going to be detrimental to health in the long term.
Yeah,
so that's a long-winded answer.
You can see me smiling so hard, because this is literally why I came out with this podcast, and why I'm so interested in metabolic flexibility, because just over the years learning all these things and realizing that there's a spectrum, and you don't necessarily want to be on that, far end of the spectrum where you're in ketosis 24/7, you're super, super fat adapted, but then, sorry, I apologize, you become carb sensitive, right? And then you can, exactly what you said, your body's inflexible. So that, you're just speaking to me, because I just love it. But I think it's super important for people to start to understand that more, right? And for me, it's the end goal for all of my clients is to become as metabolically flexible as possible, so you can use both fuel sources when they're warranted. So I guess let's dive a little bit into that. So in terms of becoming more metabolically flexible, do you have any tips or any things that you would recommend for someone who might see this or be experiencing this and saying okay, I do not want to be metabolically inflexible. I want to work towards becoming more flexible, be able to have carbs, when I want them, and my numbers not shoot up like that. So do you have any tips?
Absolutely. So I categorize them as three big categories for increasing metabolic flexibility. The first, which I want to put specifically first, is physical activity, strength training particularly. We get so obsessed with diet that I think people underemphasize how important physical activity is in metabolic flexibility. I was just speaking with Dom D'Agostino, because he's using our product, and he, if anyone is aware of him, is very strong and has a lot of muscle mass. And he's also been doing keto for about 10 years, and he's never seen a rise in his fasting glucose levels. And he tried 300 grams of carbohydrates while wearing the CGM and barely moved. And we were talking about it, and we're it's probably because you have so much muscle mass. And this is the difference we see. I would say 80% of people I see who've been following keto for over a year start to see this rise in fasting glucose values, but there's that 20% that don't experience this. And it's usually, you can circle back to body composition. It's usually these people who are very lean, are extremely physically active, and doing a lot of strength training. So for the average Joe, who is not as strong as some of these people, still strength training is super, super important. So like I said before, our skeletal muscles take up most of our circulating glucose values, our glucose levels in the blood. So when we exercise, any exercise really, but strength training is particularly good at this, it increases our insulin sensitivity. And it also, we're working on fuel switching when we're exercising, right? And it improves our mitochondrial health, which is where the source of this fuel switching is happening. And it also increases our GLUT4, which is our glucose transporter. So the more we have of that, the more the body's going to take up some of this glucose. So strength training. I have a lot of women a lot of women customers, and there's always this like phobia of looking too strong, or they're saying they're doing resistance training, and then when you probe a little deeper, it's like 20 minutes on a machine, and no one's ever really coached them on how to properly weight train. I'm sure that's a lot of things you're seeing as well. I'm not directly working with people like in a gym, but I'm a huge proponent of strength training, and I'm always encouraging people to do more weightlifting in whatever capacity.
Same.
Yeah. So that's my big number one.
Okay.
And
I
then
love it.
number two is related to nutrition. So step one with nutrition and metabolic flexibility is assessing where someone is in the spectrum of like only ever burns glucose or only ever burns ketones or fatty acids. So most Americans have probably never seen ketone levels in their blood ever, because most Americans are extremely glucose dependent. Mm-hmm. So if you're in that category and you've never been in ketosis, I'm going to say, let's try it for 3 months straight. And let's do it strictly for 3 months, and let's train your body how to use ketones as a fuel, right? And the same is true for the other people, if they're up for it. Not everyone needs to do this, but this would be my suggestion if you want to be metabolically flexible. If you've only been running off of fats and ketones for 5 years and you haven't seen any carbs in many years, let's do 3 months of low carb. It doesn't have to be high carb, 100 grams, 150 grams a day. And that you're still going to be running off of glucose. Like, we don't have to do crazy amounts of carbohydrates. The general recommendations.
You mean running off of fat? Or
yes.
Wait.
What did I? Sorry, did I say
you said
wrong?
Glucose. You said we'll still be running off of glucose, but you meant running off of fat, right? With the 100 and 150.
Yeah. So you'll be able to switch back and forth.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Sorry. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So if you've never, using glucose as your primary fuel, then we want to incorporate some carbohydrates so that your body is used to that as a fuel source as well. So sometimes that takes like, a couple months in each camp if you are so inflexible in either direction. And then once your body is used to all of the fuel sources, then we can work on quicker switching, right? So then that could maybe be like a weekly carb up for keto people, which I know you've talked about before, or maybe that's, a week on every once in a while. So for everyone, this protocol might look different, but it's just like muscle memory. If you're weightlifting often for 3 years and then you take three months off the gym because maybe you've been in quarantine, when you come back, your body will remember. You will be weaker at first, but you'll regain that much faster than the first time you ever went to the gym, right? So it's the same way. If we trained our body how to, run off different fuels for a couple months in a row, then we're going to have that muscle memory. This is backed up by research. We'll pick it up faster. So you can switch in and out faster if you've already trained these systems. So if you've already trained the systems, then we can kind of come up with a protocol that works best for that person. Just like anecdotally for me, what I like to do is like a month or two of pretty strict ketosis in the winter months, just as a time to kind of, be in a longer period. And then throughout the rest of the year, I might do like a week at a time randomly. And then most of the time I'm low carb. So it gives that like, intermittent cyclical keto in whatever type of way works for you. I haven't seen like a weekly carb up work that well for people who haven't done that reintroduction phase first, or who aren't very physically active, just because they might still just have those big glucose spikes to those carbs because their body's still not very used to it. So it depends on where you're at and what your activity level is. It works much better if you're pretty physically active. Because if your insulin levels are so low from just a long time of not having carbs, your body does have that like overreaction moment if you reintroduce carbs. So we just want to make sure that your body's not still overreacting when you have those inclusion of carbohydrates.
Gotcha. And would it be different for someone who, say, is like more overweight than someone else, or maybe they are physically active and they've been keto for a while, but they're still, in that they still have a lot of body fat on them? Have you seen anything with that in terms of going through these carbohydrate introductions and kind of that sense, and the period of 3 months of introducing that? Have you worked with anybody in that kind of category?
Yeah, if you are really overweight, it kind of also depends on how much and where that body fat lies, but it can just increase naturally our glucose levels.
Mhm.
So obesity can lead to us being just less glucose tolerant and more insulin resistant. So if you're showing a lot of signs of insulin resistance, or we know you're insulin resistant because of lab values, then I'm going to definitely stick to a more ketogenic or low carb diet for that person for longer, just to fix those problems first. So I want to focus more on correcting the imbalance of hormones before I care about
Mhm.
metabolic flexibility. So I think that you could still have a lot of success just on a low carbohydrate diet for these people. I don't necessarily think you have to go super, super low or be in, a certain threshold of ketosis, but I think it can be very helpful to retrain the body how to properly regulate these hormones like insulin and glucagon, because they go awry very easily in these instances. So you can be overweight though and have completely normal hormonal responses and not show insulin resistance.
Mhm.
Not every person who is overweight is metabolically unhealthy. They don't always go hand in hand.
Mhm.
So, if you're overweight but you're showing great metabolic health, then maybe we can work on these metabolic flexibility tips just like anybody else.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool. Cool. So I guess like my next kind of question, kind of coming off of this, it would be in terms of gender differences. So like women
Mm-hmm.
versus men, especially with, um, I mean, I kind of want to pick your brain on incorporating carbohydrates for women versus men. If you've done that with any of the people that you've worked with, but also kind of the differences between glycemic variability and things like that with women versus men. If there's any gender differences with that you've seen, with wearing a glucose monitor, continuous glucose monitor, or anything like that.
Yeah, definitely. In general, we see that women are less carbohydrate sensitive. So just that threshold of total carbohydrates you can include in your diet without going above the thresholds we're looking for, women tend to have a lower threshold than men. This is most likely due to muscle mass, like I said. The more lean muscle mass you have, the better you're going to tolerate carbohydrates, and just more glycogen storage space, right?
Mm-hmm.
So glycogen is the storage form of glucose, and we can store it in the liver and the skeletal muscle. The liver only has so much room. It can only get so big. We don't want it to get too big. But we have a lot of potential with skeletal muscle mass.
Mm-hmm.
So the more glycogen storage space you have, the better your glucose tolerance is going to be. And also women, because of hormonal differences, tend to have lower glycogen turnover. So we don't tap into glycogen quite as intensely as men tend to. So in general, that just leads to a lower carbohydrate tolerance for women. Of course, that's not true for everyone. It's going to differ person to person, just like always, but
Mm-hmm.
that's the big difference. Another difference between men and women is just hormonal changes, right? So women who are still menstruating are going to have hormonal changes that are going to affect their glucose values. So as a general rule of thumb, during the luteal phase, which is week 3 and 4 of the menstrual cycle, so between ovulation and menstruation, that's
Mm-hmm.
usually when glucose values are at its highest. This is due to just the changes in hormones during that lower estrogen, and it's also when progesterone is peaking.
Mm-hmm.
And it just makes us naturally a little less insulin sensitive. So a lot of women will notice during this phase of their cycle that their baseline glucose values are just a little bit higher, and then they'll eat the same carbohydrate foods that they have at other times of the month, and they'll have a higher glucose spike to it because we're just less insulin sensitive during this time. So that's something to be aware of. And you can't do a whole lot about it except for
Yeah.
know and then compensate for it, right? So it might be a part of the month that you like to do that very low carbohydrate week. If
Mm-hmm.
you're doing maybe 1 week of very, very low carbohydrate and 3 weeks of low carbohydrate, you might time it for that week just to have less glucose responses. And then the other big thing I see differences between men and women is with fasting.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like a big area that was when we were starting this company, there was a bunch of voices that were like, women shouldn't do any intermittent fasting. Like it's bad for hormones. It's bad for women. And we were concerned, and digging through the research, you do find that a lot of this research on fasting has been done on men or postmenopausal women. So there was this giant question mark of like, well, maybe it is bad. We don't know. And so after now seeing thousands of people's data points, a few observations have become pretty clear. Of course, this is general rule of thumb, but it seems to be that like a 16-8 intermittent fasting, so eating in an 8-hour window, tends to do pretty well for both women and men. That seems to be generally well responded. If you're super, super low body weight or irregular periods or struggling with an eating disorder, still would not recommend any type of fasting. But for most people, women or men, that 16-8 works very well, especially if you're lining up your 8 hours during daytime hours. We could talk about that, but eating late at night is not good for anybody.
Yeah.
But with shorter eating windows, that's when we start to see deviation of men and women respond differently. So especially with like OMAD, 1 meal a day, or extended fast, so longer than 24 hours. Normally, if you've been fasting for 20 hours, your fasting glucose should be lowering during that time, right? We should see in the 70 to 90 range, and then usually by like day 2 or 3, it should maybe even be lower. With women, sometimes we will see it rise while they're fasting. So they start out in the 70 to 90 range, and then at hour 20, or maybe if they're doing an extended fast into day 2, their fasting glucose values are 100, 110, 120. And that is a signal that the body is under too much stress, right? So the body is viewing fasting is a stressor, and there's a good amount, and then sometimes it's too much. And the body's starting to say that they're overstressed, and it's compensating with higher cortisol levels and then increased glucose levels. So we don't really see this effect in men. And I've only seen it in women, and it's particularly women who are already pretty lean, maybe have a lot of psychological stress or other stressors going on. Maybe they are exercising a lot, really heavy. So all these stresses compound on each other. And I think women just have a lower stress threshold than men. And so that's a difference we have noticed. And it's easy to check, you don't even have to be wearing a CGM to check this. If you're doing a 24-hour fast, you can check with a glucometer, finger stick meter, and see what your fasting glucose levels are, right? Like they should be 70 to 90. Lower is okay too if you're fasting and you feel okay, that's expected. So that's a big difference we have noticed as well.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. Just while we're on the subject of stress, so in terms of like when I was wearing my continuous glucose monitor a few months ago, like I was super interested in like my stress response, and also not just like the foods I was eating, but like how what my glucose was doing throughout the day in terms of my sleep and my stress levels. And like you've probably heard people, like, for example, this happened to me like sitting in traffic or something, or like someone cuts you off and you get like just like a spike of like anger.
Yeah,
And
a surge.
a surge of anger, and that can spike your glucose levels. Have you seen that, or like what's your experience with that in terms of one, just like those stress responses in general, and then also with sleep and not having good quality sleep and how that can affect your levels?
Yeah, absolutely. So stress is a big one. I end up talking about stress more than food sometimes, because I mean, we're under a lot of stress right now and times as well, but we're always under a lot of stress. And so like you said, there's these two different stressors, right? There's acute and there's chronic, and they both will affect our glucose values. So, but acute is normal. That's a normal stress response, and that's healthy. It's, you have a acute stressor, whether that's someone cutting you off in traffic, or it used to be maybe like somebody was chasing you or a tiger was chasing you. We're going to have this acute increase in hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. And that's going to stimulate gluconeogenesis, so creation of new glucose, and also glycogenolysis, so breaking down of that glycogen stores. And it also reduces our insulin, so that the body is making sure we have glucose available to deal with the stressor. So you will absolutely see this little spike in glucose if you are under an acute stress. So people also see this if they're eating. A lot of people will eat their lunches like while they're taking a meeting, or they're on a busy phone call, or they're like walking around talking to employees, and they'll see this glucose spike with their lunch that they don't see, a spike from in that same meal in a different setting. And it's because they're under stress while they're eating. So mindful eating is also a very real thing. We need to give our body appropriate time to digest and process food. So that would be also considered an acute stressor. But the key here is that glucose should return to normal after the stress, right? What we don't want to see is chronic stress. So that would be constantly elevated glucose levels and constantly decreased insulin sensitivity. And this happens often. Probably the most common cause for an increased fasting glucose level is chronic stress, because that cortisol levels are just always high. And so stress is very energetically demanding at the cellular level. And this can have, a whole downstream of effects. Not only does the stress raise our glucose values, but it also causes us to store more fat as visceral fat, because it's more easily tapped into for energy. So the body is always thinking, I need energy, I'm constantly stressed. And it also triggers us to binge eat, or maybe crave foods that we wouldn't normally be craving. So it has this whole downstream of effect. So I spend a lot of time really focusing on stress. There's many different stress techniques that people can utilize. I think it really depends on your personality of what's going to click the most, because the goal is we want it to be embedded in your routine. It has to feel like it's part of your routine. And I tell everybody, both sleep and stress management is a skill, just like learning a new sport or learning a new instrument. You have to practice at it, right? We can't just wake up one day and be like, I'm no longer a stressed out person, right? It takes practice. We can't just complain about it either. We have to do something about it. So it's, day in and day out taking, I always talk about building upon habits that already exist. So if you already brush your teeth every morning at 7 a.m., pair that with a new habit. So after I brush my teeth, I take 2 minutes to do some deep breathing exercises. Or, I always go on a walk after dinner. After that, I do 5 minutes of meditation. So try to pair it with a habit that's already ingrained in your routine, and it's easier to make it a little sticky. So that's kind of stress in a nutshell. I'm often recommending meditation apps or breathing exercises or walks, journaling, but sometimes it's whatever works for the person is fine, of course.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I feel like everything you're saying is literally everything that I say too, and that I recommend, and I might need to make you my co-host on this show because you're awesome.
Awesome.
But yeah, I mean, that's completely, like, literally everything you said about stress is exactly what I recommend, and something that I implement with a lot of my clients, with those who have the goal of fat loss. And that's something that, a lot of people miss out on. And it's like, you don't, if you're hiring a coach or someone and they're just literally giving you like macros to follow, like, stop.
Walk away. Yeah,
just walk away, because that is it's a piece of the puzzle, but it's just, there's so many other pieces to it. And so that's why, like with my clients, we, like with the biofeedback, we literally implement we look at stress, we look at sleep, and we implement stress management techniques. And when they start to do that, then they start to see the changes that they've been wanting to see. And it's just like such a huge piece of the puzzle that a lot of people are missing out on. So in terms of like using a continuous glucose monitor for, if your goal is fat loss or you're trying to recomp your body, how have you seen, like, in just that stress, looking at the stress and then kind of just being aware of it and seeing how different foods affect that? Is that something that, you've seen, or kind of maybe talk a little bit? I mean, you talked about the stress part of it, but like specific to weight loss or fat loss.
Yeah, definitely. And I think stress is something that's normally so hard to quantify, right? And it's helpful to have these like HRV markers and other metrics of stress, but it is hard sometimes for people to even acknowledge that they're stressed. Like, I'm like, I can see that you're stressed, and they're like, I'm not stressed, I'm fine. Like, this is just my personality. But finally, pairing it with data, they can see, they're like, I am stressed. And they can see on the weekends, typically they'll have lower fasting glucose values because they don't feel as stressed. And then it rises during the week. And it's like, what do you think might be different? And they're like, I'm definitely more stressed, and not sleeping as well, which is also a stressor on the body, right? We can touch on sleep, but I like to talk about when people ask about metabolic flexibility, I explain it as like a hybrid car of you can run off two different energy sources, but the car is not going to run if it's not a well-maintained car, right? So before we can even focus on fuel sources, we have to focus on the engine and the structure of the car, and that's rest and repair, that's sleep and stress. So it's so fundamental to reaching any health goal that it has to be addressed first. So we always bring that up, like week one, if you're on the program, is let's talk about sleep and stress. Let's see where you're at, because you really can't make great progress, whether it's metabolic flexibility or whether it's weight loss or body composition. You can't make good progress if those two areas aren't being fully addressed. So I think they're equally as important as what you're eating and how you're moving. So it's something we're talking about a lot for any type of health goal.
Yeah. I love it. That's super cool. I did kind of just another thought popped in my head because I want to make sure that we cover this. So in terms of when people are, so say either they're using a CGM or, testing their blood glucose via a glucose monitor for postprandial measurements, when do you usually recommend like looking at that? Because we know usually it's 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, it should come back down. Like what are the trends that we should see if we're looking at if we're wearing a continuous glucose monitor and we're trying to see how a certain food affects us, like what are the trends that are quote unquote normal or that we want to see versus those that we obviously don't?
Yeah, definitely. So American Diabetes Association and World Health Organization do not recognize like a peak glucose value as a meaningful metric. They are only looking at that 2 hour postprandial mark. So 2 hours after you eat something, they want it to be below 140, and that would be considered normal. So I certainly don't agree with that, but that is the recommendation in mainstream world of glucose. But from the research that's available and the data we see, we want to look at three things. We want to look at your peak glucose value, so how high you get in a response to a meal. And we want to look at that 2 hour mark because we want to see you back at pre-meal glucose values at that 2 hour mark. And then I want to look at the general shape of your glucose response. So we're looking for a small area under the curve. So the first metric, peak glucose value, will maybe be hard to catch on a glucometer because it can happen pretty fast, right? So most healthy people, most non-diabetics will peak within 30 minutes. So that's something, if you're trying to see how high you're going and you just have a glucometer at home, I would test 30 minutes after because most people peak around that time. And we aim for values below 140 as that peak glucose value. There's no clear-cut data on this because, WHO and ADA is only looking at that 2 hour mark, but there is significant research that suggests we start to see consequences when it gets above 140. So we want to see below 140 most of the time. There's much stronger associational data with consequences above 160. So that's where we really don't want to see it hitting 160 often at all. I've heard some people in the low carb sphere talk about never wanting their glucose above 120. I don't have convincing evidence that that's a great threshold to aim for. So I stick to 140. If you're never eating carbs, you really shouldn't go above 120 because that would be what causes you to go to 140. But I don't have convincing data, we don't have convincing data that hitting levels of 120 is detrimental to health. So just a small caveat there. And then we want to see a return to pre-meals within 2 hours of eating. So a lot of times people will eat maybe something like fried food, and that combination of a lot of fat with starch will cause a prolonged glucose response because the body is slowed down digestion because of all the fat, and it kind of releases glucose over several hours as opposed to a sharp spike. So you might only go to 120, which would be considered good, but you might still be at 110 4 hours after eating the meal when you started at 90 before the meal. So that would be a large area under the curve in a prolonged glucose response. And that is a signal that your body is releasing insulin for that whole 4 hours, right? So that postprandial area under the curve is a good proxy for insulin response. So we also want to just look at what the shape of the curve looks like. Does that make sense? Is that
that makes sense. Yeah, and I think that's something too, like the especially when you're wearing a continuous glucose monitor, I think like the trend is the most important thing that you're looking at, right?
Absolutely.
Versus
Yeah.
just like the spikes. Okay, cool. I have so many more questions coming to mind. So I think, well, okay, I have three questions, three more
Okay.
questions. Probably more than that, but I just quickly want to touch on. So you mentioned sweet potatoes, and we were talking about postprandial numbers. So do you have any data on resistant starch? Because that's something that people are talking about, where you cook a sweet potato, you eat it right away. That could have some effect on your level versus if you cook the sweet potato and then you cool it down, it creates more of this resistant starch. And then if you eat it, then is there a difference? So have you seen data with that, maybe with yourself or anybody that you're working with?
Yeah, we've prompted that experiment in a lot of our customers. So a lot of our customers are just there to be curious and learn about themselves. We'll
Mm-hmm.
prompt all types of experiments for them, and that's one of them. And it seems to have an effect in a lot of people, but not everybody. So it certainly doesn't make the glucose response worse. But for a lot of people, they'll see a difference of maybe 10 to 20 points lower with the cooled version of the starch. And for some people, the response is exactly the same. So it might
Mm-hmm.
help, it might not. Maybe it just depends on your genetics at that point. But it generally works. I would say maybe 75% of people see a lower response. It's a
Gotcha,
rough
gotcha.
estimate.
Okay. This is a really random question. Have you ever had kabocha squash or
I don't
kabocha
think I've had
squash?
it. I have, but I don't think I've had it while I was wearing a CGM.
Okay, I'm
That's
just
what you're
curious. It's one of my favorite foods. It's also known as the Japanese pumpkin, and anybody who's listening to this, if they follow me on Instagram,
wondering.
like I literally post it every day, and I eat it every day.
Mhm.
But I tested it out while I had my monitor on a few months ago, and I had no reaction to it. But I did have I would test that versus sweet potatoes, and I had a little bit of reaction to sweet potato. It is lower in carbs, but it's more of it's a squash, obviously. But I'm just curious, like if you've ever had it and tested, because I've had some people say that it has spiked their glucose numbers, but I also don't I didn't dive into the context of where they were. It
Mhm.
was just like responding on Instagram. But yeah, I was just curious about that. So yeah, okay, resistant starch just dependent on the person, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And same with the squash. It might have been that it has more resistant squash and that's why you had a lower response, or it could just
Mhm.
be that you just respond better to it. There
Gotcha.
were certain foods that I always kind of avoided because I was like, they're super starchy. I don't want to have, too high of a glucose response. And then I ate them while I have a CGM on. I was like, wow, I respond really well. And it's such a relief. Like bananas specifically, I love
Hmm.
bananas for whatever reason. And I always kind of avoided them, or I'd eat a third of a banana at a
Yeah.
time. And my glucose does not move with bananas. So it's well, it's much more comforting knowing that I can not that a banana is
Yeah.
bad food, but I don't have to
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
worry what's happening with my glucose. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. What about other fruits? Have you seen any trends with other fruits with people, like berries versus maybe
Yeah.
a banana or a cantaloupe or something like that?
Yeah. So again, everyone responds differently, but the two fruits that almost everybody seems to have huge glucose spikes to are grapes and pineapple, which makes sense because they are higher glycemic
Hmm.
variability or glycemic index foods. But everybody spikes from those foods, myself included. And then berries tend to be super low glycemic. Almost everyone responds well to berries. And then
Okay.
everything else in between is kind of, a personal mixed bag. Because I've seen a lot of people spike very high from bananas and then I don't, and it
Hmm.
just kind of depends. I personally spike pretty high from mangoes as well, but I've seen some people tolerate them okay.
Hmm.
um, but yeah,
Okay.
berries tend to be really low. Cherries also seem to work very well
Cool, cool. Okay.
for most
And this
people.
brings me to another question, which is not, I have one more subject that I want to cover real quick, but I do have another question. Do you have time?
Yeah, yeah, we're good.
Okay, cool. Just maybe 10, 15 more minutes. Okay.
Okay.
Or 10, whatever. We can even do a part two if we need to. But so my question is in terms of consuming, when we are talking about glucose variability and tracking and consuming carbs alone versus consuming carbs with protein or a little bit of fat. So I always recommend when you do consume carbs to help dampen that response, that you don't have any naked carbs, even if they are sweet potatoes, bananas, fruit. You're always consuming them with a protein source or a little bit of fat. What have you seen with that in terms of recommendations you've made, or for example, eating, someone eats a banana just plain versus they eat it with maybe a tablespoon of peanut butter? And have you seen differences in that? And like, what would your recommendation be?
Yeah. We recommend the same exact thing of no
Okay.
naked carbs. So it definitely helps specifically with some protein paired with it to blunt that glucose response. And even just the order of what you're eating. So, let's say you have eggs and oatmeal for breakfast. If you eat the eggs first and then the oatmeal, you will have a lower glucose response than if you had like a bite of eggs, a bite of oatmeal, and like went back and forth and kind of ate them as a mixed meal. So eating that protein or fat first definitely helps, but no naked carbs is a general rule we tell everyone as well. So it actually
Awesome.
works.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And so I guess kind of another question on this point in terms of like, is there any like amount of fat, for example, that you like? So this is something that I get to because it's like, well, people say you're not supposed to eat fat and carbs together, but then you're saying, don't eat carbs alone. And is there like anything that you've seen in terms of that, like where it may be too much fat to consume? Because also when we're talking about, carb ups and things like that, or cyclical keto, you generally hear like, okay, if you're going to, if you're usually eating, higher fat and lower carbs, when you do a carb up, you want to lower your fats. Do you have any like, experience with that, or like that kind of maybe there's like a fat threshold, or is it obviously dependent
Yeah.
on, the individual? Or,
Yeah, I get this question a lot too, because it does seem contradictory, right? It's like you hear not to combine them, but then I'm like, combine them, don't eat
yeah.
them by themselves. And from the research that is available, what appears obvious to me is that it just depends on the food quality, right? So all of this research about pairing carbs and fat together and that being like overwhelming the mitochondria and causing, all this oxidative stress, it's usually with hyperpalatable processed food. So it's the starch plus the oils, and that's just like a recipe for disaster. That does not look good on a CGM data. Just like we were talking about the fried food, it's going to cause this like prolonged glucose response. So it is going to blunt the glucose response, just like no naked carbs, but it's going to cause your body to digest that meal for a long time because starch has a ton of glucose molecules in it. So if we're combining anything that's like any form of carbohydrate, like refined carbohydrates, plus fat, I would not recommend that. I just wouldn't recommend eating refined carbohydrates in general, of course, but then I certainly wouldn't recommend combining it with fat. And that could even be like, everyone knows like, candy and cookies and pasta, but that's also just any form of refinement. So I always take the example of oats. So I've tested all types of oats, and steel cut oats is always like a 20-point increase. And then instant oats was almost double that. And so they're the same thing, but they've been processed, right? So I always try to encourage people to think of what does processed food really mean? That's such a vague term. But if it's been like acellular versus cellular carbohydrates, if that cell wall has been squished and now it's just free forming starch, you're going to have a much higher increase than if it's in that original whole food state that has a fiber lined wall. So combining food versus keeping them separate, I think it's more about food quality. If we're eating whole foods that are as close to their intact original state as possible, I don't have a lot of concern for combining the carbs with fat. I haven't seen that in the data as being an issue. I'm not convinced from research that that's an issue. I still think portion sizes matter and calories matter at the end of the day. I don't think calories are an end all be all, but I certainly don't think we should just toss them away as meaningless.
Yeah.
So having a massive meal that's all whole foods and a lot of fat and a lot of carbs, your body probably won't tolerate that super well. So I'm not sure that was exactly the answer you were looking for. But
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Definitely, for sure. Okay, last topic I want to talk about. So, in terms of kind of going back to training and athletes and things like that, I know you mentioned when we were talking offline that you work with some endurance athletes, and this is something that, especially with some of the recent one-on-one clients that I'm starting to work with, some triathletes and things like that, and we talk about, fat adapted athletes for sugar burners and things like that, and kind of how to, like, what is the best way to fuel that type of activity. The traditional fueling. I mean, I did triathlons in college, and it was all about like eating a high carb meal the night before. We used to have like these pasta nights, and then race day, it would be like stuff all the goos you can in your pocket and go race. And no wonder I felt like crap, because I was just like, whatever. Anyway, that's another story. But just based on your experience and maybe some of the athletes, endurance athletes that you've worked with who are, fueling for triathlons or marathons or things like that, can you talk a little bit about how you balance out, traditional fueling with goos or gels versus if they are trying to maintain that fat adaptation and use fat as much for fuel, but also maybe incorporating those fueling sources?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will preface with saying I'm not a performance coach, right? Like I'm not helping them to be obtain their certain performance goals. I'm looking at their data as metabolic health and longevity lens. So sometimes these goals, they butt heads, right? If you want to be an Olympic level athlete and you also want to have longevity in mind, those two goals might not align. I don't know if we can achieve those at the same time. But I don't have any Olympic athletes on my program right now. But So most people are weekend warriors, or they're doing a marathon or something because they want to be healthy. So their goal is health and longevity, and they're doing these activities to help coincide with that. And so from that lens, most of these people come in kind of doing traditional fueling, and they're doing, lots of heavy carb meals, day before a race or day before practice even, and goos throughout the running, throughout cycling or whatever they're doing. And then we'll see it in their data. They're having these very, very big glucose spikes when they're loading up on carbohydrates. They're going to super physiological levels. Like, we don't want to see that if we're also trying to focus on longevity. And then they're bonking. You can see it in their glucose data. They're hitting a wall and glucose is plummeting because you run out of stores, and then you're not very metabolically flexible and able to tap into these alternative energy stores. So being able to show that through the data to these people, we can realize that maybe we don't need as many carbohydrates as we thought we did to still perform pretty well. So it might look different for everybody of what that amount is, but it's easier when you have the response to titrate back and say, okay, maybe I don't need that many carbohydrates, or maybe I'm going to practice for 3 weeks of running off of ketones, being fat adapted, and we'll trial that for 3 weeks. Maybe they're 6 months away from a race, so they're trying it and they're teaching their body how to easily tap into each of these fuel sources. So we might try it for a couple weeks, and then we can really dial back of how many carbohydrates we need when they want to do an extra long, running day. We can increase some carbohydrates so they have their glycogen stores full, but their body is able to switch fuel sources during the activity when they need it and not hit that wall, not see that giant glucose drop, and they're able to maintain energy levels. So, I don't have like a clear cut and dry solution for what works for everyone, but most of the time, if their goal is also longevity, we can dial back on some of those traditional fueling types of just like carbs, and figure out a way to tap into both fuel sources and not have these huge glucose spikes every time you are, fueling the day before and loading up your glycogen stores. That most people find that they can perform at the level they're looking for without having to do that.
Gotcha. And would you recommend, like, have you played around with recommending, instead of using like a goo or anything like that, especially on like longer races, if they're not just going to go straight without any fuel, like some type of fat or protein source or anything? Have you seen that or
Yeah, a lot of people will like the little like coconut butter squeezes, or like almond butter squeezes, and even some like have a little bit of sugar in them. They might be like sweetened, but the plain fat ones would be preferable if you're trying to like avoid hitting that wall. So a lot of people like the little like fat squeezes.
Yeah.
I don't know the technical term for those.
Yeah, like the little nut butter packets.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, last little thing. So while we're on the subject of exercise, so in terms of, we talked about endurance, have you, I'm just curious, have you seen any, like worked with anybody who does any type of training like CrossFit or like super high intensity interval training? We know that like, this probably can go down like another rabbit hole, but maybe just like a brief explanation or just experience for what you've seen in terms of their glucose responses during exercise. Because we know, like, especially with high intensity exercise, or maybe like intense strength training that can happen. But specifically for like any CrossFit athletes that you've worked with, or
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So like you said, with a higher intensity exercise, especially if you're in a fasted state, you will probably see a glucose spike when you're exercising, right? And that is not necessarily to be concerned about, because it's not the same as getting a glucose spike from like eating a bowl of pasta. It has all of these net positive benefits that compensate for that potential glucose spike. And it's just because it's very intense exercise, it's glycolytic, and so your body wants glucose really fast for that exercise. So most of the time it's not that big of a deal. It might spike to like 140, 160, and then you should have lower glucose values the rest of the day because of the increased insulin sensitivity and all the other factors that come with exercise. But with like CrossFit, I'm not sure if you've seen this and you know what I'm going to say, but with CrossFit athletes specifically, the exercise seems to be extra intense for some of these people. And we might see glucose spikes to like 190, 200, 210. And that starts to become a little more concerning, because that can create a lot of oxidative stress and a lot of free radicals and oxidative damage. And just like fasting, exercise is a stressor, and we come back stronger because of that acute stress. But too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. So with these people, we might want to maybe dial back the intensity a little bit. We want to focus on hydration, because that can also increase our glucose values, or maybe consuming a little bit of food beforehand, so your body isn't having to create so much glucose and it has a little bit of immediate energy available from a recent meal, because it's very exacerbated if we're working out in a fasted state, which for most people is fine, and maybe probably preferable. But if at that really, really high level of intensity, it might be counterproductive.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, one of the reasons I asked that question, I used to do CrossFit. I did a study on CrossFit and keto years ago, and I've just learned so much since then. And I personally don't do CrossFit anymore, but like when I was doing it even like 2 years ago, I wish I had a continuous glucose monitor to see, because I was definitely like overdoing it, fasting and just all the rabbit holes, like going down all the rabbit
Yeah,
holes. But like 2, 3 years ago, but just learned so much from it. And again, really why I, preach this concept of metabolic flexibility, but also, stress management and understanding, like sometimes, like you said, too much of a good thing is a bad thing when it comes to fasting and intense
right.
exercise and stuff
And
like
if you're going into the exercise already in a stress state because maybe you didn't get very much sleep last night, or you drank the night before, or you're super stressed, like that's going to be way worse for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, you just sparked another question. But maybe we'll have to do part two, because I wanted to. We'll do a part two maybe, because I want to talk about alcohol. But yeah, I feel like this is getting a little bit longer. I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I have like so many other questions just popped up. So maybe we'll do like a part two, maybe part three. Maybe I'll make you
Yeah,
my
I'd be happy to do
co-host.
it. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this was so cool. I like all of this information is so useful, and I know everybody listening is going to take a lot away. Do you want to kind of wrap up and tell us, where people can find you, find Nutrisense, if they're interested in getting or trying out a continuous glucose monitor? What's the process of that, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're interested in getting a CGM, you can just go to our website, nutrisense.io. We have different plans depending on how long you want to do it for. So we have a no commitment option where you just get one CGM, maybe learn a few things. But we also have subscription plans where you would do it for a couple months if you really want to see how your body changes through different diet or stress, or maybe you will have weight loss goals. So we have different options depending on your goals. And then to just kind of keep up with us on Instagram, Nutrisense.io. We're always posting something interesting that we're seeing in the data, or CGM examples. So it's usually pretty fun. And then me personally, you can find me on Twitter at Collier1, usually posting interesting research I'm finding as well.
Sweet. Awesome. Well, I will link all of that in the show notes so everybody can check that out for sure. I also have a CGM that's waiting for me to put on. So I'm
Nice.
going to, I've
Yeah.
been waiting for quote unquote the right time to put it on. There's no right time. I'm just gonna do it. So I'll definitely share, share
Yeah.
that, share what I find. And yeah, I definitely want you to come back on and answer some more questions. Maybe we can do, because I'm sure people are going to have questions after
Hmm.
listening to this episode. So maybe I can like gather any, questions that they have, and we can do like a Q&A based off of that, and then maybe dive into some other of the many, many questions that I want to ask you.
Yeah, I'm down. It would be fun.
Awesome. Sweet. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And I will talk to you later.
All right. See ya.